Hey guys, before we get started on part 12 of this 800B project, let me show you something that I own. This is a really cool radio and it's comparable to the 800B. What is it? It's a Midwest Model 916. I believe they were made in Cincinnati, Ohio. This one was made in 1949 and in a lot of ways it's comparable to the 800B. First off, take a look at the dial face. It's got a big dial face that fits into a large opening just like the 800B. This thing has AM, the newer FM, and shortwave. It has electric tuning and a tuning eye. And it also, what you can't see here is it has high fidelity speakers. This is a really nice set. It's full of features, it's well laid out, and it's extremely well built. I'm pretty excited about restoring this radio someday because this is one of my few premium radios, and I'm pretty excited about it. And I'll get around to it hopefully sooner rather than later. But for now, let's get on to the record player for this 800B.
Here is the record player that came with the 800B. This is a Webcor model. I don't know much about the model number yet. It looks from the shape of some things that it's possible this could be a voice and music machine. It's hard for me to be real sure. I'm not an expert on record players, although I am learning about them quite a bit because about half of the machines I get have record players with them. And then I have folks who bring me just their record players who want those done as well. So I'm learning about them pretty quickly. And there's some things about this that look voice and music, but then there are some things about it that look like they're not voice and music. The reason that voice and music comes up just about every time I talk about record players is that voice and music made, the vast majority of record players that were sold in the United States during this time period. They didn't make all of them. Philco made their own, RCA made their own, although RCA also used voice and music machines. Then there were Colaros, they made stuff for Magnavox. But Zenith was made by Voice and Music. There were a lot of brands that were made by Voice and Music. Admiral made some of their own record players, so there were some record players that were not Voice and Music, but most of the record players that I encounter from this time period are Voice and Music. I'm suspecting that this one is, but with this particular vintage, I often will see a control on this side of the platter as well. So I'm not sure yet. When I get a hold of Gary at Voice and Music Audio Enthusiasts, I'll send him a picture of the bottom and a picture of the top. And he will know really quick whether this is voice and music. So now, either way, whether this is voice of music or not, it's clear that this machine was not the original with that radio. And my biggest clue, of course, is that it says stereo right here. So this machine is designed for stereo. The trouble is that Scott Radio is not a stereo radio. So that's no big deal. I'll set this up for mono if this is the one they want to keep. And it's a nice record player. It's got a nice tone arm. It's a little bit heavy, actually, but it'll work. And it's a cool looking unit, and it's what they have. So I don't think they're going to be all that interested in buying another record player that will also have to be restored. So I'm pretty sure I'll be restoring this one. And in fact, unless I find some kind of a critical flaw, a critical failure in it, then I'm sure I'll be restoring this one. Let's talk about this now. So we'll start with the base. The base is a nice gold color. This will polish up okay. It'll look nice. This area up here, I'm not sure, that looks like rust to me, so I may have to, actually no, that's just some goop that's going to scrape right off. Oh, that's beautiful. That'll clean up nicely. So this base will clean up beautifully. I will probably not remove this little plate right here, this decorative plate, because these things are often so brittle that you try to remove them and you crack them. And once you crack them, they never look good after that. So I'll leave that be. I may even leave this big knob in place. I'll try to get this off, but I'm not going to try real hard because these will be brittle too. This clear plastic that was available at the time, by the time it's now 70 years after it was made. Well, this was made post 58, so let's say 60 years, 50 to 60 years after it was made. Well, this thing here is going to be really brittle. And it takes nothing to crack these. So I'm just going to probably leave it in place and clean it in place. It's not ideal, but it works. The way this plate is designed, there aren't really any areas that are under the knob that I have to worry about anyway, so that should be okay. It's sort of a heavy tone arm. It's a metal tone arm. Most of the time there will be some sort of a spring adjustment that will control the tracking force. This is going to be too heavy for most of the cartridges that are available for this thing. But I do have a replacement ceramic cartridge for this right here. This looks like it was a ceramic cartridge, so I do have a replacement for these. This maybe it's a tetrad. It's hard to be sure, but that part's no problem. It's adjusting the tracking force. Again, I haven't familiarized myself with this yet, so let's just do a basic tour. So the base can be cleaned up nicely. The mat on the platter, it's still got some flexibility to it. There are no cracks in it. It'll clean up really nicely. Maybe some rubber renew on it will make it look nice too. The support arm seems to be in good shape. There's no stiffness there. There's nothing wrong there. It's even got the little lubrication or the little felt on there. But when I turn this by hand after hitting the reject, it seems to work with the arm, and so I think that's working. And let's see here. Let me try this. Let's see if it goes back to rest. That'll tell me a lot. Yes. And it should turn off. There you go. Okay. So great. I think that the mechanism is at least sound enough to work when I operate it manually, which is always a good test of whether the thing's going to work at all. And the platter, it was really stiff last night when I first dug this thing out of the box, and I put a couple. First, I cleaned off the spindle right at the top of that spindle bottom bearing, and cleaned up the inside of the platter here, the inside of the bushing that rides on this shaft. When I cleaned that up and then put a couple drops of sewing machine oil on it, it helped a lot. And so now, and it wouldn't turn at all yesterday, and now it turns some. There is, I mean, the wheel slips a lot. I can tell because it turns really slowly even when it shouldn't. So I got it set at the 78 speed. Let's give it a quick spin before I lift the platter off. So what I'll do is I'll turn it on here. So I don't want to really handle the chassis much once I've plugged it in, because I haven't investigated the electrics yet. I do know that it has been electrical taped on the cord. So I don't really know what's going on under here yet. So I really don't want to handle the metal plate. So let me turn on my isolation transformer, turn on my variac, and it's okay, it's perfectly safe to bring one of these motors up on the variac, but don't spend a lot of time in the low voltages because it's just going to put a lot of current through the windings. That's not good for it. So immediately I'll bring it up to about 60 volts, and that's when I start to go a little slower. I see it wanting to move. There we go. See, I had to give it some help. There we go. It needed a little help to get started. I'm at 100 volts now. 120 volts, that's as far as I'll go. Let me see if I can, what happens if I hit reject. Ooh, it slows it way down. Of course it wants to do it. There we go. Okay. I'll turn it back on. Okay, so apparently what's engaging the idler wheel against the platter is not working, because when I lift the platter off and I move the idler wheel over, it will grab it and operate it. So the fundamentals are okay. It was a really simple test, a really quick test to tell me that pretty much everything that needs to work inside this thing should be working. It just it will need a lot of cleaning, a lot of lubrication that requires a ton of time. We turn off everything here. We unplug it so I don't have any little mishaps. It will require a lot of time. which every record player requires. That doesn't surprise me. First, let me lift this platter off of here. You have to get creative sometimes with the way to support these because everyone's a little different. But a wide open box is great. Like these can boxes or fruit boxes are really nice. So this is a raspberry box. Okay, so metal platter. Kind of see what it looks like underneath. It's I don't know who made this. It's funny because I just worked on an Admiral that had that same look with the 3 weld spots and this thick bushing with the narrow gear right there at the top. The gear looks like it's all in pretty good shape. All the gear teeth look okay, so that's just going to be a cleaning. So this will work out well. I'll take real good care of this rubber mat. I'm not going to try to remove it. It is glued on, so I'll just clean it up and I'll rubber renew it, and that should be fine. Okay, immediately I see sticky everywhere. Now underneath, immediately I see that there's some sticky stuff and things that are supposed to slide are just a little sticky. That bottom bearing has got some goo all over it, sticky goo. Oh yeah, the idler wheel, this top part of the idler wheel, the part that drives the platter, is hard as a rock. I'm surprised it drove it that much at all. And the bottom part is hard as a rock too. So, and it looks like it may be missing a spring because it doesn't really want to come to rest against the platter like it's supposed to. It will return this way. Let me turn it on. Maybe that's the problem. Ah, there we go. Okay. I forgot it had turned off. So it's still a little stiff. You see it doesn't move freely. What should be happening is that you see how it wants to go that way a little bit? There's a spring that pulls that against the platter, and that's how it works. Plus the motion of the platter should draw it in against it right about here. And I'm sorry, right about here. So there's the motor drive pinion. So there's a spring that will push it against the platter, and then the motion of the platter will push it even harder against the platter and against the drive pinion from the motor. So my point is that all of this will need a lot of cleaning and lubrication, but I think it's fundamentally okay. Of course, this idler wheel is going to have to be replaced. First thing I notice is that this thing is going to be a pain in the ass right here because this idler wheel will not be able to lift straight off like most record players. Okay, see that? This is missing the clip that's holding it down. That's probably not a big deal on this one because it's not going anywhere, but I'll put a clip on it. But it's going to have to be, the motor's going to have to be dropped down in order to replace that. The way to replace that is you simply just take this thing out of here and send it off to Gary at Voice and Music, and he will, if he doesn't have one in stock, he'll take yours and re-rubber it. So, it's not a cheap proposition, but considering what you're getting out of the deal, it's not a bad proposition either. He does a really good job. I've never had a single problem with anything that Gary has done for me. And Gary is always fast. He's always on top of it. He's very, very prompt. He ships right away. And the guy, I've never sent him an email where he didn't respond within an hour or two. I mean, the guy's just awesome. I can't say enough good things about Voice and Music Audio Enthusiast. If you do record players at all, he's the only place you need to know. All right, so all this stuff here is basically sound. Let's get a real quick peek underneath. Okay, tone arm is locked down. Usually on record players, I don't know if you can see this, the tone arm can be... Oh, okay, I see. All right, I was wondering how I can adjust tracking force right here. And this is kind of a Voice of Music. I've seen Voice of Musics that are like this. Right here, it rests against this steel. When it comes up down, it rests against this part right here. And there's a spring down here, and that will be adjustable somehow. So great. So I should be able to adjust tracking force on this, I think. More on that when we get there. Alright, so you want to watch that support arm. It'll want to come out, but just you don't have to worry about it. Just lift it up as you set this thing down, and then it'll kind of rest lightly on that spindle. That's okay for a couple minutes. I'm not gonna be doing a lot of playing with it while it's here. So this motor will have to come out while I replace the idler wheel. This whole motor assembly will come out. I'll get this idler wheel off of here, send it off to Gary. These suspension springs are, I mean, what can you say about them? They're fine. I don't know why they put the foam inside these, but I typically will grab a piece of open celled foam and I'll stick it down in there too, just because that's what was there when it started. So what I see mostly here is just a lot of sticky lubrication everywhere. So I know the switch is working because we observed it working. Looks like they left the original signal cables, pieces of it in here when they swapped it out for stereo and when they put this machine in the Scott. This changer mechanism does not look like a Voice Music to me, but I'll let Gary decide on that. I don't see made by Voice Music on there, and often they'll say that. I'll disassemble sections and I'll clean them up, but I'm going to disassemble as little as possible because I don't like to have to try and adjust everything afterward. They'll work better if you just leave be what you can leave be. But there are a lot of items in here that are going to have to be cleaned and that requires taking them apart. So what I'm going to have to do, I'll take this motor off. I'd have to take it off anyway to get to the upper bearing and clean both the upper bearing and the bottom bearing. I'll clean and lubricate those. When I have the motor off, I'll take that idler wheel off. I'll send it off to Gary. Now I will probably disconnect the motor. It looks like it was taped here, so that'll make it nice and convenient for me because then I'll be able to disconnect it right there. Piece of cake. Disconnect the motor, set it aside, disconnect it from the switch here, or pull the switch out. I'll probably disconnect it from the switch. And so I'll set the motor aside, and that'll make it a lot easier to work on the rest of the machine. And I'll go ahead and clean and lubricate everything. I'll replace the cartridge in the tone arm. When the idler wheel gets back, I'll put the idler wheel in. When I get everything here, then I'll make all the adjustments, because often there will be a height adjustment to be made, you know, with the idler wheel and things like that. So I'll get all that done. While I'm waiting on all of that, I'll clean and polish the whole setup. So really, it's pretty straightforward, just a lot of labor time on this. Record players are always that way. A lot of times people don't want to do a record player because of the time it takes and the money it costs to do one. But this guy wants his machine to work well. This machine will look at home in his Scott, even though it's not the original. It'll look really nice when I'm all done. Let me go ahead and disconnect these wires, and I'll get started on pulling this motor. I'm probably only going to get to go so far with this record changer, and then I'll have to get onto the speaker, because when I send the parts off when I send the idler wheel off to be re-rubbered, I'm going to be waiting for it. I just want to indicate on the motor that the two leads that connect to the line cord, and it makes sense. I mean, I could figure it all out, but why would I want to have to figure it out when I can just as easily mark the wires? So there you go. This one here, the switch. It's not going to hurt me to cut it and then splice it later. Okay, so I'll be able to lift this motor out. Oh, can't forget the ground. And the ground is going to be connected to this little terminal right here, this little ground lug. Rather than cut this or desolder it, I'll just remove that ground lug, and that'll also give me a clue later as to how it's supposed to be remounted. Supporting these when they're upside down is a real pain in the butt, let me tell you. I will eventually come up with some kind of a jig that's adjustable, that will work with anyone, but I haven't done that yet. It'll probably have to be made of wood and have some pivots on it, so I've got a little bit of engineering to do on that before I can come up with that. Go ahead and put that screw back where it was. I've disconnected that ground lead. Now, just for future reference, when I connect a ground to the chassis, which I'll do on this to get rid of hum, that ground to the chassis will connect right here, probably to the same location. I want to get it, you always want to try and get the ground as close to the motor ground as possible, so you can avoid any kind of current going on in the metal chassis of this record player, because that might introduce hum into the whole works. So you want to try and put all your grounds in one spot if you can. Alright, so the motor is disconnected. Now it is mounted with screws, 3 screws, 1, 2, 3, but they come in from the other side. So what's going to happen is I'm going to disconnect this motor, it's going to drop down, and then there might be a thing or two attached to it, and I'll have to go ahead and get those disconnected, so we'll see. Here are those 3 hex head screws. Okay, so they'll be 1/4 inch. Now I like to loosen things first without removing them to see what it is that is going to be loose. Okay, so the best thing for me to do, you see this linkage here attaches to the motor. This linkage here attaches to this little lever arm right here that is part of the whole motor assembly. So I want to make sure that linkage doesn't get bent or doesn't damage anything. So what I need to do is get that linkage off. So there's a little press-on clip here. The way you do it is you just work those side to side a little bit, and usually they'll slide off. If that doesn't work, then you grab a pliers and you kind of get it sideways if you can, and you kind of turn it and pull it upward at the same time. You know, let me just try this. I think maybe, because I don't want to tear this up if I can help it, maybe this will be able to go that way and slide right off of that linkage. It looks like the only thing that's going to connect the motor to this base assembly. There we go. I was right, it slipped right off of that linkage. Okay, so great. I didn't have to worry about that clip. I'll probably wind up straightening it a bit from all that tinkering. Always label your baggies, guys, otherwise then in the end you're going to be staring at a bunch of baggies wondering what goes where. So label that. Let's see what we have now. It feels like it's still, yep, there's still a linkage attached to it. Let's see if we can see how that works. This long linkage right here. This long linkage is attached right there at the base of this pivot. Okay. Now this linkage isn't going to want to come off that easily, so let me see if I can. There is the bottom of that pivot, or the top of that pivot. I'll remove that little clip, and that spring will come off, and that should enable me to remove that. So I'll have to turn this back over. Okay, so I pull this little clip off, Hard for you to see, I'm sure. And that spring comes flying off. I'll have to refer to the video to remind myself if there's a washer there. And then this pivot should slide right off now. Here it did. Okay, just came right off in my hand. Okay. So the way that was mounted, this pivot slides down this shaft. Okay, slides down this shaft right here. And but between the pivot and the base is this linkage that I just disconnected right here. You see the linkage? Okay, I'm going to leave that mounted to the record changer. That is what operates the movement of the idler wheel against the platter. Okay, so I'm going to remove this pivot as an assembly, and I'm going to go ahead and put it for the time being in this baggie with this spring and the clip, and then I'll just refer to the video later when I want to know how it goes back together. Okay, so now I have a motor assembly, and I don't have any idea where this just fell off of. Crap. Wasn't there. It wasn't there. I'll have to sort that out. So I'll have to look back. I'll be looking at the video a lot for this one, because I don't know where that sat. But it went somewhere, and I don't want to lose it. So I'm going to put it in the bag with that motor assembly, because that's the stage at which this thing fell out. I really dig this video thing because it helps me a lot. So what I have now is a motor that I will, in a bit, remove from this plate. While I'm at it, I'll clean this plate. And there are some little suspension mounts that look like they're in good shape. I don't see any cracking, they're not hard. I didn't notice any looseness or any play in the motor, and that usually is what happens when you get these cracking and getting hard and chunks falling out and stuff. So I'll remove the motor from this plate, and then what I'll do is there's a top bearing housing right here and a bottom bearing housing. I will remove the bottom bearing housing. This rotor of the motor will slide out that way. And then I'll clean this top bearing housing. I'll lubricate them with a little sewing machine grease, very little. Put it all back together. They're self-aligning. Those bearings will be ball and socket self-aligning bearings, so I won't worry about that. And I'll assemble it all back together. This turns pretty freely, so that's not going to be an issue, but still, there's usually some felt wicks. Yep, there's a felt wick in there that I'll put a little grease on that will enable, or a little bit of oil on, that will enable it to stay wet for a long time with lubrication without being over lubricated. Okay, so I'll set that motor aside. So things have gotten now you see things have gotten a bit simpler underneath. So this is that lever that I disconnected from that shaft with the spring on it. I'm going to leave this in place. I may take it off to clean it and put it back on, but otherwise it's going to stay where it is, and all this stuff is going to be easier to work on. The good news is it doesn't look like I'm going to have to mess with these signal wires at this end at all. They're in good shape. What I'm going to do, they have a way of catching on things that will drive you nuts. When they catch on things, they just get torn right out. So what I like to do early on is tape these signal wires down so that they don't catch on things. And I can always pull the tape off later, or I can leave it on, depending, because when I install this in the cabinet, that's another time when they like to catch on stuff. So I'll just make sure that doesn't happen. In the process of all this, I'm going to remove these remnants of wire that the previous owner left in place. So these would have been the signal wires that came originally with this unit. Okay, so I will set this aside now, because my principal focus at the moment was to get to that idler wheel. I already have plenty of replacement cartridges, cartridge replacement kits, so I can take care of this. That's no big deal. What I want to do is get that idler wheel on the way. So let me set this aside. Let's have a look at our principal focus now. This is going to be this idler wheel. I need to get this off right away, get this off to Gary, and to get a new one either being made or replacement sent back to me. This looks like a fairly common one, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. Of course, it was missing the clip, and there are no height adjusting shims on either side of this. So I will have to sort that out. I'll have to do there's one really thin shim here. You see that? There's one really thin shim. So it's really thin and flexible, and it's white. They're usually black, so I didn't notice it. Alright, so the idler wheel slips right off of the pivot like that. Oops, it wants to get stuck on this little clip. Well, that clip is just being a pain in the butt, let me tell you. And if it gets stuck going on, or coming off, it's going to get stuck going on. So it just takes a little bit of a combination of tenderness and muscle to get this kind of thing apart. You just coax it, you talk it into coming off, and eventually it goes along with what you want. But you got to talk nice to it. You can't call it names, otherwise it'll break. I have noticed that when I am angry and calling things names, that's when they break. So I put two and two together and say, if I don't call a name, it won't break. What do you think? There we go. Clip is off of there. Now the idler wheel will lift straight off of here because there's no clip interfering with it. And this pivot assembly I can put in the baggie. I'll leave this shim on it. Alright, and I'll put this in the baggie the way it is, later to be cleaned and lubricated. So mission accomplished. What I wanted to accomplish with the record player right now is getting this idler wheel off of there. Gary has good descriptions of his parts on his website, and he'll have sizes and that sort of thing. So I'll be able to look at this. Wow, this rubber has no flexibility at all. I can look at this, measure it, take measurements, diameter measurements, inside diameter measurement of the bushing and thickness of the various rubber parts and overall height, and I ought to be able to match it up with something that Gary has. So okay, I'll get to work on that, and next up is going to be the speaker. I needed to get started on this, but now I'm going to be kind of stopped until I get this part, because I really don't want to work
I warned
on it
you.
until I have all the
I
parts
said this would be a long video, and it has been. But there's a lot I needed to show you on this record player. Next up is going to be this speaker. It's a Jensen speaker. You see a lot of these in 800Bs. And this one here, sadly, is in pretty rough shape. So we'll get started on it straight away. So for tonight, this is Michael from your Western Outpost in Salt Lake City. We'll catch you next time when we start the speaker. That's all for now.